Well, hello, it's that time of day again when we study a chapter of the Bible together. Actually, let me make sure my microphone is on. Let's not make that mistake again. Okay, it's good. We're talking about Psalm 132 in our Bible study, and you can download all the free PDFs and outlines for these chapters on our website at tobelikechrist.com. Check out the other links down in the descriptions. There's a link to our new podcast, a link to some other books and things, so good stuff down there. Psalm 132. We do not know the author of this one. However, we do finally, again, have some references in the New Testament back to this one. So Psalm 132 is referred to in Acts chapter 2, verse 30. That's when Peter is preaching. And then in Acts chapter 7, verse 46, that's when Stephen is talking. If you don't know about Stephen and Peter in the book of Acts, we do actually have our Acts study completed. I can't remember if I made videos for them, but I know that the outlines are completed. I think I made videos for them. I think. You can check. I know the outlines are done, at least. So if you want to go take a look at the outlines, those are available and they're on the website. Our themes for today, let's look at two of them. Number one, a blessing on Israel for the sake of King David. And then number two, God's anointed one comes as the strength and the light of Israel. And now to our definitions. The first word we want to define is a song of ascent. This psalm is a song of ascent. Most scholars think that these were psalms that were sung by the people of Israel as they ascended up the hill to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the holy days that God prescribes in His law. We are going to talk about the word horn, like a ram's horn or an ox horn or rhinoceros horn, but not in that sense necessarily. This appears in verse 17. A bull's horn, for example, is a symbol of its strength. The Bible occasionally uses the term horn in a similar way, but talking about men. A person's horn is their strength, or a nation's horn is that nation's strength. We're going to see that in verse 17. And then once again, we have the term Zion, which I just want to remind everybody is a term that can refer to the city of Jerusalem as a whole. This chapter is once again long enough to have more than one section, so for our outline we have two sections. The first one is verses 1 through 9, David's ambition to build a house for the Lord. So Psalm 132 opens with the writer asking God not to forget his servant David. David, you remember, was king of Israel and Judah. He was the second king of Israel and Judah. Now, the author's kind of appealing to him because David kind of set the benchmark for being a good king, being a godly king. And the writer's now looking back and kind of reminding God, if you can say that, reminding God about David. And he's like, David was a really good guy. And for his sake, can you bless our nation? That's kind of what he's asking. Specifically, the author brings to mind David's resolve to build a house for the Lord. What kind of house are we talking about? Well, David wanted to build a more permanent home for the Lord in the city of Jerusalem. You remember, previous to David's life and during David's life, the Ark of the Covenant, the holy items of God, were transported in the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was a portable tent. It had to be portable because Moses and Aaron took it around in the wilderness as they were journeying to the Promised Land. But now that they were settled in the Promised Land, David wants to build something more permanent. He accomplished this in a couple ways, some fully, some partially. First, he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and he built a tent for it in 1 Chronicles 15 and 16. Second, he planned with his son, Solomon, to build a magnificent temple, a permanent structure in the city of Jerusalem to house the Ark and the holy items that were associated with the worship of the Lord. Now, that temple wasn't completed during David's lifetime. It was completed during Solomon's lifetime. But David had this intention, had this purpose, and made preparations for the building of this permanent house. So the psalmist is bringing this up, placing it before the Lord. This pursuit of David's was an honorable one, and the psalmist is reminding God, as if God could forget, of David's good heart so that the Lord would bless the nation for his sake. Now we come to section number 2, verses 10 through 18. The Anointed One is the title here. In light of David's pure heart and good intention, the psalmist asks God to bless David's descendants and to honor the promises that he had made to them, which applied to the nation of Judah. One of those promises was that a descendant of David's, an anointed one, all the kings were anointed, would remain on the throne of Judah. In the immediate context of this psalm, when it was written, the title of Anointed One could be applied to any of the kings that followed after David and ascended to the throne after his death. The author of Psalm 132 was therefore asking God to bless the current king of Judah, whoever that was. We don't know exactly when this was written, so we don't know the current king contemporary with the writing, but basically he's asking God to bless the nation for David's sake and how honorable he was, how godly he was. So that's the immediate context. But if you know the rest of the Bible, if you know the bigger context of the idea of this anointed one, the anointed one is more significant than any human king of Israel or Judah. It refers to the Christ. And if you know, Christ just means anointed one. The Christ would come to reign on David's throne as one of his descendants, to be king with a shining crown, as verse 18 says. He would be a powerful figure, the horn of verse 17. He would be a light to the world, the lamp of verse 17. And through him, the power of God would defeat all enemies, both physical enemies, earthly enemies, and spiritual enemies, verse 18. And so that is Psalm 132. The anointed one is coming, and the anointed one is going to be blessed by God to accomplish all of these things. Referring to a king of Israel, yes, but prophetically speaking of the greater anointed one, the Christ. For application today, I want to talk a little bit about humility in interpreting the prophetic. Looking back at the prophecies about Jesus in the Psalms, in Psalm 132 specifically, we are able now to look back in hindsight and to understand this concept of the anointed one and how Jesus fits into that identity and that list of qualifications. But that wasn't as clear to the Jews who met Jesus during his lifetime. That's clear if you read the Gospels and the way that the Jews, many of them, rejected Jesus. They had read this psalm. This psalm was around during their time, right? It was part of their national literature, part of their scriptures. So they had read these same verses, these same details, and they had created a framework, a way of interpreting what the Christ was going to be, what he was going to look like. But the problem was, when Jesus finally got there, they were totally wrong. They didn't even recognize Jesus when he shows up on the scene. They took all the details that they knew that were limited from the Old Testament. They created this idea, this rigid structure about the form that Jesus needed to fit into. And when Jesus actually showed up, they're like, no, you're not the guy. But he really was the guy. And I think there's an application here for us about being humble when interpreting passages in the scriptures that deal with the future. There are some statements and prophecies in the New Testament about what will happen in the future and how the end of time will play out. But much like the Psalms that prophesied about Jesus, we're only given a little bit of information. We're not giving everything in all of its detail, and God doesn't have a giant book explaining how it's all going to play out, right? We're given limited details about some of these things. We don't know everything about how God will wind down time, all the factors that are going to be involved in that, and how every fine detail of every prophetic statement is going to be fulfilled. Therefore, I think it's wise to have a level of humility when it comes to building a framework for future events. I think humility was what Jesus appreciated about his apostles. They had read the Psalms, and yet certainly they didn't have the identity and the work of the Messiah all worked out clear, plain as day in their minds. But they were humble enough to allow Jesus to teach them and teach them how those things ought to be interpreted and to show them the unique way that God had determined to work out his will and how that fit with all the prophecies. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, many of the other Jews, they weren't willing to do that. They had their idea of who the Messiah was going to be, and they were stuck on it. The apostles were humble enough to be taught. We, as application, should respect and stand for the things that the scriptures are clear about, but we should also be humble when interpreting those things that are less clear. Because like the Jews, we may be surprised at how God works out his plan.